Bellingham had set out for Charing Cross, and even if he had committed the murder, he would have no object in raising this commotion. His cue would have been to remain quiet and know nothing. The probabilities were all against the personator being Godfrey Bellingham. Then could it be Mr. Jellicoe? The answer to this question is contained in the answer to the further question. What could have been the object of the personation? What motive could this unknown person have had in appearing, announcing himself as John Bellingham, and forthwith vanishing? There could only have been one motive, that, namely, of fixing the date of John Bellingham's disappearance, of furnishing a definite moment at which he was last seen alive. But who was likely to have had such a motive? Let us see. I said just now that if Mr. Jellicoe had murdered John Bellingham and disposed of the body in the mummy case, he would have been absolutely safe for the time being. But there would be a weak spot in his armor. For a month or more, the disappearance of his client would occasion no remark, but presently, when he failed to return, inquiries would be set on foot, and then it would appear that no one had seen him since he left Queen Square. Then it would be noted that the last person with whom he was seen was Mr. Jellicoe. It might further be remembered that the mummy had been delivered to the museum some time after the missing man was last seen alive, and so suspicion might arise and be followed by disastrous investigations. But supposing it should be made to appear that John Bellingham had been seen alive more than a month after his interview with Mr. Jellicoe, and some weeks after the mummy had been deposited in the museum. Then Mr. Jellicoe would cease to be in any way connected with the disappearance, and henceforth would be absolutely safe. Hence, after carefully considering this part of the newspaper report, I came to the conclusion that the mysterious occurrence at Mr. Hurst's house had only one reasonable explanation, namely, that the visitor was not John Bellingham, but someone personating him, and that that someone was Mr. Jellicoe. It remains to consider the case of Godfrey Bellingham and his daughter, though I cannot understand how any sane person can have seriously suspected either. Here Inspector Badger smiled a sour smile. The evidence against them was negligible, for there was nothing to connect them with the affair save the finding of the scarab on their premises, and that event, which might have been highly suspicious under other circumstances, was robbed of any significance by the fact that the scarab was found on a spot which had been passed a few minutes previously by the other suspected party, Hurst. The finding of the scarab did, however, establish two important conclusions, namely, that John Bellingham had probably met with foul play, and that of the 4 persons present when it was found, one at least had had possession of the body. As to which of the 4 was the one, the circumstances furnished only a hint, which was this: if the scarab had been purposely dropped, the most likely person to find it was the one who dropped it, and the person who discovered it was Mr. Jellicoe. Following up this hint, if we ask ourselves what motive Mr. Jellicoe could have had for dropping it, assuming him to be the murderer, the answer is obvious. It would not be his policy to fix the crime on any particular person, but rather to set up a complication of conflicting evidence that would occupy the attention of investigators and divert it from himself. Of course, if Hurst had been the murderer, he would have had a sufficient motive for dropping the scarab, so that the case against Mr. Jellicoe was not conclusive. But the fact that it was he who found it was highly significant. This completes the analysis of the evidence contained in the original newspaper report describing the circumstances of the disappearance. The conclusions that followed from it were, as you will have seen: 1. That the missing man was almost certainly dead, as proved by the finding of the scarab after his disappearance. 2. That he had probably been murdered by one or more of 4 persons, as proved by the finding of the scarab on the premises occupied by 2 of them and accessible to the others. 3. That of those 4 persons, 1, Mr. Jellicoe, was the last person who was known to have been in the company of the missing man, had had an exceptional opportunity for committing the murder, and was known to have delivered a dead body to the museum subsequently to the disappearance. 4. That the supposition that Mr. Jellicoe had committed the murder rendered all the other circumstances of the disappearance clearly intelligible, whereas on any other supposition they were quite inexplicable. The evidence of the newspaper report, therefore, clearly pointed to the probability that John Bellingham had been murdered by Mr. Jellicoe and his body concealed in the mummy case. I do not wish to give you the impression that I, then and there, believed that Mr. Jellicoe was the murderer. I did not. There was no reason to suppose that the report contained all the essential facts, and I merely considered it speculatively, as a study in probabilities. But I did decide that it was the only probable conclusion from the facts that were given. Nearly 2 years had passed before I heard anything more of the case. Then it was brought to my notice by my friend Dr. Berkeley, and I became acquainted with certain new facts, which I will consider in the order in which they became known to me. The first new light on the case came from the will. As soon as I had read the document, I felt convinced that there was something wrong. The testator's evident intention was that his brother should inherit the property, whereas the construction of the will was such as almost certainly to defeat that intention. The devolution of the property depended on the burial clause, clause 2, but the burial arrangement would ordinarily be decided by the executor, who happened to be Mr. Jellicoe. Thus the will left the disposition of the party under the control of Mr. Jellicoe, though his action could have been contested. Now, this will, although drawn up by John Bellingham, was executed in Mr. Jellicoe's office, as is proved by the fact that it was witnessed by 2 of his clerks. He was the testator's lawyer, and it was his duty to insist on the will being properly drawn. Evidently he did nothing of the kind, and this fact strongly suggested some kind of collusion on his part with Hurst, who stood to benefit by the miscarriage of the will. And this was the odd feature in the case, for whereas the party responsible for the defective provisions was Mr. Jellicoe, the party who benefited was Hurst. But the most startling peculiarity of the will was the way in which it fitted the circumstances of the disappearance. It looked as if clause 2 had been drawn up with those very circumstances in view. Since, however, the will was 10 years old, this was impossible. But if clause 2 could not have been devised to fit the disappearance, could the disappearance not have been devised to fit clause 2? That was by no means impossible. Under the circumstances it looked rather probable. And if it had been so contrived, who was the agent in that contrivance? Hurst stood to benefit, but there was no evidence that he even knew the contents of the will. There only remained Mr. Jellicoe, who had certainly connived at the misdrawing of the will for some purpose of his own, some dishonest purpose. The evidence of the will, then, pointed to Mr. Jellicoe as the agent in the disappearance, and after reading it, I definitely suspected him of the crime. Suspicion, however, is one thing, and proof is another. I had not nearly enough evidence to justify me in laying an information, and I could not approach the museum officials without making a definite accusation. The great difficulty of the case was that I could discover no motive. I could not see any way in which Mr. Jellicoe would benefit by the disappearance. His own legacy was secure, whenever and however the testator died. The murder and concealment apparently benefited Hurst alone, and in the absence of any plausible motive, the facts required to be much more conclusive than they were. "Did you form absolutely no opinion as to motive?" asked Mr. Jellicoe. He put the question in a quiet, passionless tone, as if he were discussing some cause célèbre, in which he had nothing more than a professional interest. Indeed, the calm, impersonal interest that he displayed in Thorndyke's analysis, his unmoved attention, punctuated by little nods of approval at each telling point in the argument, were the most surprising features of this astounding interview. "I did form an opinion," replied Thorndyke, "but it was merely speculative, and I was never able to confirm it. I discovered that about 10 years ago Mr. Hurst had been in difficulties, and that he had suddenly raised a considerable sum of money. No one knew how or on what security. I observed that this even coincided with the execution of the will, and I surmised that there might be some connection between them. But that was only a surmise, and as the proverb has it, he discovers who proves. I could prove nothing, so I never discovered Mr. Jellicoe's motive, and I don't know it now." "Don't you, really?" said Mr. Jellicoe, in something approaching a tone of animation. He laid down the end of his cigarette, and as he selected another from the silver case, he continued, "I think that it is the most interesting feature of your really remarkable analysis. It does you great credit. The absence of motive would have appeared to most persons a fatal objection to the theory of what I may call the prosecution. Permit me to congratulate you on the consistency and tenacity with which you have pursued the actual, visible facts." He bowed stiffly to Thorndyke, who returned his bow with equal stiffness, lighted a fresh cigarette, and once more leaned back in his chair with the calm, attentive manner of a man who is listening to a lecture or a musical performance. "The evidence, then, being insufficient to act on," Thorndyke resumed, "there was nothing for it but to wait for some new facts. Now, the study of a large series of carefully conducted murders brings into view an almost invariable phenomenon. The cautious murderer, in his anxiety to make himself secure, does too much, and it is this excess of precaution that leads to detection. It happens constantly. Indeed, I may say that it always happens, in those murders that are detected. Of those that are not we say nothing.